Imagine a civilization that survived over 1,000 years of relentless conquest, crusades, and forced assimilation, yet managed to preserve its language and culture against impossible odds. This is the story of the Wends, the forgotten Slavic peoples of Central Europe whose legacy still echoes in the forests and rivers of modern Germany. Around 480 AD, as the Western Roman Empire crumbled into dust, something remarkable was happening in the Pripyat marshes of what's now Belarus and northern Ukraine. These vast wetlands, stretching for thousands of square miles, served as the demographic crucible from which successive waves of Proto-Slavic populations would venture westward, carrying distinctive cultural practices and social structures that would fundamentally reshape the European landscape. Yet the initial migration wasn't random chaos, it was coordinated, deliberate movement. Archaeological evidence from sites like Komarovo and Bantsero reveals gradual abandonment of traditional settlement patterns, with ceramic assemblages showing increased standardization, suggesting organized groups rather than scattered refugees. The distinctive Prague-type pottery found across these early sites demonstrates technological continuity, even as populations relocated, indicating that migrating groups maintained their cultural identity while adapting to new geographical conditions. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing catastrophe, they were pioneer communities seeking better opportunities. These westward movements followed established river corridors, particularly along tributaries of the Dnieper and Bug systems, which provided both navigational routes and fertile alluvial soils suitable for the mixed agricultural economy characterizing early Slavic communities. The migrants brought sophisticated knowledge of wetland management, including techniques for constructing elevated settlements on artificial islands and developing drainage systems that would prove invaluable in their new territories along the major Central European river systems. Think about that. They were hydraulic engineers over 1,500 years ago, building artificial islands and managing water systems with remarkable precision. The Elbe River system became the primary corridor for Wendish settlement expansion. Archaeological investigations at sites like Torno and Dessau reveal substantial occupation layers dating to the late 5th and early 6th centuries. These settlements demonstrate remarkable adaptation to local conditions, with housing structures evolving from traditional semi-subterranean dwellings of the Pripyat region to above-ground timber constructions better suited to different soil conditions and climate patterns of the North European plain. Excavations at Torno have uncovered distinctive ceramic kilns and metalworking facilities, suggesting these early communities rapidly established specialized craft production to meet expanding population needs. The material culture recovered from Elbe Valley sites reveals sophisticated understanding of riverine resource exploitation. Fishing implements, bone hooks, net weights appear alongside agricultural tools, indicating these communities maintained mixed subsistence strategies that had sustained their ancestors in the marshlands. Particularly significant are remains of wooden fish weirs discovered at several sites, demonstrating advanced hydraulic engineering capabilities that allowed systematic exploitation of seasonal fish runs while maintaining navigational channels for waterborne transport. Settlement patterns along the Oder River system present a different developmental trajectory, with communities establishing themselves primarily on elevated terraces overlooking the main channel and its tributaries. The site of Gross Raden, though representing a later period, sits atop earlier occupation layers, demonstrating continuous habitation from the 6th century onward. These early phases reveal settlements organized around central courtyards with residential structures arranged in roughly circular patterns, reflecting social organization principles carried forward from the Proto-Slavic homeland. The archaeological record from Oder Valley sites shows evidence of extensive trade networks developing by the mid-6th century, with amber artifacts from Baltic sources appearing alongside iron implements, suggesting contact with established metalworking centers. Vistula River settlements present perhaps the most complex archaeological picture, with multiple occupation phases representing successive waves of migration and settlement. The site of Krakow Nowa Huta contains stratified deposits spanning from the early 6th through 8th centuries, revealing evolving construction techniques and material culture that chronicle the transformation of migrant communities into established regional populations. Early phases show typical Prague culture characteristics with semi-subterranean houses and handmade pottery, while later levels demonstrate increasing architectural sophistication and adoption of wheel-thrown ceramics. The linguistic evidence for this period provides crucial insights into cultural processes accompanying territorial expansion. Proto-West Slavic, the ancestor of all Wendish languages, began diverging from the broader Slavic linguistic family during these migration centuries. Phonological innovations characteristic of West Slavic, particularly development of nasal vowels and specific consonant cluster simplifications, can be traced through place name evidence and early loanwords into Germanic languages. The northern dialects, which would eventually develop into Palabian, and related languages show evidence of early contact with Germanic speakers, particularly in vocabulary related to trade and craftsmanship. The formation of early tribal confederations represents a crucial development in Wendish political organization, moving beyond village-level social structures toward more complex regional identities. The Oberdreich Confederation, centered in the region between the lower Elbe and Baltic coast, emerged during the mid-6th century as a response to both internal population pressures and external threats from expanding Germanic populations. Archaeological evidence from Oberdreich territories reveals distinctive settlement hierarchy, with fortified centers like Oldenburg and Rerik serving as focal points for surrounding agricultural communities. These early strongholds, constructed using sophisticated timber and earthwork techniques, demonstrate centralized planning and coordinated labor, indicating emerging political authority beyond the kinship-based leadership typical of smaller communities. The material culture associated with these sites shows evidence of specialized craft production and long-distance trade connections. Bronze and silver ornaments recovered from elite burials display stylistic influences from both Scandinavian and Byzantine sources, suggesting Oberdreich leaders were actively participating in broader European exchange networks. Weapon assemblages from warrior graves include high-quality iron spears and axes, indicating both martial prowess and access to advanced metallurgical technology. The Lutici Confederation developed along different lines, emerging in territories between the Oder and Elbe rivers during the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Unlike the Obodrites, who developed centralized leadership structures, the Lutici maintained more decentralized political organization based on autonomous tribal groups united primarily for military purposes. Archaeological evidence from Lutici territories shows less pronounced settlement hierarchy, with fortified sites serving primarily as refuges during conflicts rather than permanent administrative centers. Lutici material culture emphasizes martial aspects, with weapon deposits at cult sites like Rethra indicating the central role of warrior bands in social organization. Religious practices across all early Wendish groups show remarkable continuity with Proto-Slavic traditions while adapting to new geographical and social conditions. Sacred groves and spring sites appear consistently across Wendish territories, with archaeological evidence indicating continuous ritual use from the migration period through later centuries. Votive deposits at these sites include both traditional offerings like pottery and food remains, as well as more elaborate items like metal ornaments and weapons, suggesting evolving ceremonial practices. Development of fortified cult centers represents significant innovation in Wendish religious organization, moving beyond natural sacred sites toward constructed ceremonial complexes serving broader regional populations. The transformation of dispersed Wendish communities into organized tribal confederations accelerated dramatically during the 7th century, driven by increasing pressures from Frankish expansion westward and the need for coordinated defense of territorial boundaries. The Veleti Confederation emerged as the most formidable of these political entities, encompassing territories stretching from the Oder River eastward to the Vistula Basin. Unlike earlier village-based leadership structures, the Veleti developed a sophisticated system of rotating leadership among 4 primary tribal groups: the Cassini, Cirsipani, Tolensane, and Ridari, each controlling distinct geographical regions while maintaining collective decision-making authority for matters affecting the entire confederation. Archaeological excavations at Beren Lübchen have revealed the material foundations of Veleti political organization, with a massive fortified complex covering over 12 hectares and featuring multiple construction phases spanning the 7th through 9th centuries. The site's defensive earthworks, reinforced with timber palisades and incorporating sophisticated gate systems, demonstrate engineering capabilities requiring coordinated labor from multiple tribal groups. Within the fortress, excavators have uncovered evidence of specialized workshops for metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture, indicating these centers served not merely as military strongholds but as economic and administrative hubs for the broader confederation. Military organization within the Veleti Confederation reflected this decentralized political structure, with each tribal group maintaining its own warrior bands while contributing to larger forces for major campaigns. Weapon caches discovered at sites like Gross Raiden contain standardized spear points and axe heads, indicating coordinated production and distribution systems while maintaining regional variations in decorative elements, preserving tribal identity. The quality of metalwork in these assemblages, particularly complex pattern welding techniques used in sword construction, demonstrates that Veleti smiths had achieved technical parity with their Frankish and Saxon counterparts. The Obodrite kingdom developed along markedly different organizational lines, evolving from earlier confederation structure toward centralized monarchical authority under leaders claiming descent from legendary founding heroes. The royal centre at Oldenburg became the focal point of this political transformation, with successive construction phases revealing increasingly elaborate residential and ceremonial complexes. Excavations in the royal quarter have uncovered foundations of timber halls exceeding 30 meters in length, with internal post arrangements suggesting spaces capable of accommodating several hundred individuals for feasting and ceremonial gatherings. Obodrite royal authority manifested through control of trade networks connecting the Baltic coast with interior regions, particularly the lucrative amber routes linking Scandinavian sources with Carolingian markets. The port settlement at Rerik, serving as primary commercial outlet for Obodrite territories, developed sophisticated harbour facilities including wooden quays and warehouse structures, facilitating large-scale maritime commerce. Religious practices across Wendish territories during this period evolved from localized sacred sites of earlier centuries toward elaborate temple complexes serving as focal points for tribal and confederate identity. The cult center at Arkona, perched on dramatic chalk cliffs overlooking the Baltic Sea, became the most significant religious site in the Wendish world, attracting pilgrims and tribute from communities across the region. Archaeological investigations at Arkona have revealed multiple construction phases, with earliest temple structures dating to the mid-7th century and showing continuous expansion and elaboration through subsequent centuries. The temple complex centered around a massive wooden idol of Svantevit, described in contemporary sources as standing nearly 4 meters tall and carved with intricate details including multiple faces and symbolic attributes. But then everything changed. The Saxon Wars initiated by Charlemagne in 772 AD fundamentally altered the political landscape of northern Central Europe, creating ripple effects profoundly impacting Wendish territories even before direct Carolingian. Military intervention reached Slavic lands. The systematic Frankish campaigns against Saxon strongholds along the Weser and Aller rivers displaced thousands of Saxon refugees who fled eastward across the Elbe, seeking sanctuary in Wendish territories, fundamentally disrupting established demographic patterns. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lüneburg and Bardewick reveals sudden abandonment layers dating to the 770s, with hastily buried treasure hoards and partially dismantled fortifications indicating the rapidity with which Saxon communities evacuated their traditional settlements. These Saxon refugees brought detailed knowledge of Carolingian military tactics, siege techniques, and administrative methods, intelligence that proved invaluable to Wendish leaders preparing for inevitable confrontation with Frankish expansion. The Obodrite Confederation, occupying territories immediately east of Saxon lands, initially adopted a pragmatic approach toward these refugees, incorporating Saxon warriors into their military forces while extracting information about Carolingian strengths and vulnerabilities. Excavations at Oldenburg have uncovered weapon caches from this period containing a mixture of traditional Wendish armaments and Saxon-style equipment, suggesting systematic efforts to upgrade military capabilities using refugee expertise. Charlemagne's construction of fortified positions along the Elbe, including major strongholds at Hamburg and Magdeburg, represented a strategic shift from temporary military campaigns to permanent territorial occupation. These fortifications, built using advanced engineering techniques and garrisoned with professional soldiers, posed unprecedented challenges to traditional Wendish military tactics based on mobility and guerrilla warfare. The Obodrite leadership under Prince Dragovit initially pursued diplomatic accommodation with Carolingian expansion, recognizing the futility of direct military confrontation with the vastly superior Frankish army. However, this diplomatic accommodation proved fragile when Carolingian administrators began implementing systematic Christianization policies directly challenging fundamental aspects of Wendish religious and social organization. The destruction of sacred groves and prohibition of traditional ritual practices created widespread resentment among Wendish communities, particularly when combined with heavy tribute demands straining local economies. Archaeological evidence from cult sites like Grossraden shows deliberate destruction layers dating to the 790s, with broken ritual objects and burned temple structures indicating violent suppression of traditional religious practices. The establishment of the Hamburg-Bremen Archbishopric in 787 AD marked the beginning of systematic missionary efforts directed toward Wendish territories, representing fundamental shift from ad hoc evangelization attempts of earlier centuries to coordinated institutional campaigns backed by Carolingian political and military authority. Early missionary activities among Wendish populations followed established patterns developed during Saxon conversion campaigns, focusing initially on conversion of political elites whose acceptance of Christianity could facilitate broader social transformation. The strategy proved partially successful among Obodrite leadership, with several prominent nobles accepting baptism during ceremonial visits to Carolingian courts, though the depth and permanence of these conversions remained questionable. Wendish resistance to forced conversion manifested through various forms of passive and active opposition, demonstrating the resilience of traditional religious beliefs and practices despite official political accommodation with Carolingian authority. The persistence of traditional burial customs provides archaeological evidence for this religious continuity, with grave goods, including traditional amulets, ritual vessels, and symbolic objects appearing in supposedly Christian cemeteries throughout the early 9th century. But then catastrophe struck, and it would change everything. The death of Emperor Otto II in December 983 triggered the most catastrophic collapse of German imperial authority in Eastern Europe since the Magyar invasions of the previous century. Within weeks of the emperor's demise reaching Wendish territories, coordinated uprisings erupted simultaneously across the entire frontier, from the Baltic coast to Bohemian borderlands, suggesting extensive prior planning and communication networks that had operated beneath the surface of apparent submission to Saxon rule. The revolt began on June 29, 983, when Wendish forces launched simultaneous attacks on German strongholds at Havelberg, Brandenburg and Zeitz, overwhelming surprised garrisons and capturing vast quantities of weapons, supplies and siege equipment that would sustain the rebellion for decades. Add the coordination required for such widespread simultaneous action reveals the existence of extensive communication networks linking Wendish communities across hundreds of kilometers, networks that had apparently functioned throughout the period of nominal German dominance while remaining completely undetected by Saxon administrators. Messenger routes followed ancient paths through sacred groves and along traditional pilgrimage circuits, with coded messages transmitted through religious festivals and seasonal gatherings that appeared innocuous to German observers but carried detailed military intelligence and coordination instructions. The cult center at Rethra served as crucial hub for this communication system, with pilgrims arriving from throughout Wendish territories, carrying information about German troop movements, fortification weaknesses, and local political developments. The fortress at Brandenburg, which had served as primary administrative center for Saxon control over Haveli territories, fell after a 3-day siege, demonstrating sophisticated Wendish understanding of siege warfare techniques, including use of captured German siege engines turned against their former operators. The destruction of Christian infrastructure formed a central component of the Wendish uprising, with churches, monasteries, and religious artifacts becoming primary targets for systematic elimination throughout rebel territories. The cathedral at Havelberg, which had served as primary symbol of German Christian authority over the Haveli tribe, was completely demolished with such thoroughness that later German sources described the site as appearing never to have been inhabited. The restoration of traditional Wendish religious practices followed immediately upon the destruction of Christian infrastructure, with elaborate ceremonies marking the rededication of ancient sacred sites and reconstruction of temple complexes that had been abandoned or destroyed during the period of German dominance. The temple at Arkona underwent massive reconstruction during winter 983-984, with archaeological evidence revealing installation of a new wooden idol of Svantevit that stood even taller than its predecessor and incorporated decorative elements that may have been crafted from melted Christian religious objects. The reconstruction work required coordinated labor from communities across the island of Rügen, with specialized craftsmen arriving from distant territories to contribute their skills. Sacred groves throughout Wendish territories experienced similar restoration efforts, with communities working to remove Christian symbols and structures while replanting native tree species and reconstructing traditional ritual facilities. The revival of traditional religious practices extended beyond restoration of physical sites to include re-establishment of ceremonial cycles and ritual observances that had been suppressed during the period of Christian dominance. The autumn harvest festivals of 984 were celebrated with unprecedented elaboration throughout Wendish territories, with contemporary German sources describing the sound of ritual drums and ceremonial horns echoing across frontier regions as communities publicly demonstrated their return to ancestral religious traditions. The military effectiveness of Wendish resistance forces improved dramatically as the uprising progressed, with captured German equipment and incorporation of Saxon refugees providing access to advanced weapons technology and tactical knowledge. The economic foundations of Wendish resistance proved remarkably sustainable, with traditional subsistence strategies supplemented by systematic exploitation of captured German resources and revival of trade networks disrupted during the period of Saxon dominance. The port at Wollin experienced dramatic expansion during the mid-980s as Wendish merchants re-established commercial connections with Scandinavian trading partners who had been excluded from German-controlled markets. The failure of German attempts at reconquest during the late 980s and early 990s reflected both the military effectiveness of Wendish resistance and broader political crisis within the German Empire following Otto II's death and minority of Otto III. Imperial resources were stretched across multiple frontier conflicts, with Magyar raids in the southeast and ongoing tensions with France, limiting forces available for operations against Wendish territories. The campaign of 991, led by Margrave Eckhard of Meissen, ended in complete disaster when German forces were ambushed while crossing the Spree River, with archaeological evidence from the battle site revealing remains of hundreds of German soldiers who were killed or drowned during the chaotic retreat. The consolidation of Wendish territorial control during the 990s established foundations for sustained independence that would persist for decades, with development of administrative institutions and military organizations capable of maintaining effective governance over liberated territories. For over 160 years, the Wends would maintain their independence, preserving their ancient traditions and demonstrating to the world that they could govern themselves effectively without German overlords. This golden age of Wendish independence saw flourishing trade, artistic achievement, and religious revival that would become legendary in Slavic cultural memory. But storm clouds were gathering. The proclamation of the Second Crusade by Pope Eugene III in March 1146 fundamentally transformed the nature of German-Wendish relations from localized frontier conflicts into a coordinated pan-European religious war that would ultimately destroy the last vestiges of independent Wendish political organization. The papal bull Divini Dispensatione, issued specifically to authorize crusading operations against Wendish territories, granted the same spiritual indulgences available to crusaders bound for the Holy Land to those participating in campaigns against the pagan Slavs, effectively legitimizing total warfare against populations that had successfully resisted German expansion for over a century and a half. The strategic planning for the Wendish Crusade began during the Diet of Frankfurt in March 1147, where German nobles and ecclesiastical leaders developed comprehensive campaign strategy dividing Wendish territories into distinct operational zones assigned to specific military commanders. Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, received responsibility for operations against the Obodrite Confederation and Baltic coastal regions, while Albert the Bear, Margrave of Brandenburg, was tasked with conquering Lutici territories and re-establishing German control over the Middle Elbe region. The military preparations undertaken during spring and summer 1147 dwarfed any previous German military effort against Wendish territories, with archaeological evidence from assembly points like Magdeburg and Brunswick revealing massive accumulations of weapons, siege equipment, and supplies indicating an army numbering in the tens of thousands. The siege equipment assembled for the Crusade incorporated the most advanced military technology available in 12th century Europe, with master engineers recruited from across the continent to construct specialized devices designed specifically for attacking Wendish fortifications. Henry the Lion's northern campaign commenced in July 1147 with coordinated assault on the Obodrite stronghold at Dobbin, which had served as crucial defensive position controlling access to the Mecklenburg region. The fortress, situated on an island in the Schweriner Sea, had been continuously fortified and expanded since the Great Uprising of 983, with archaeological evidence revealing multiple construction phases incorporating increasingly sophisticated defensive features. The siege lasted 6 weeks, with German forces employing floating platforms to transport siege engines across the lake, while Wendish defenders utilized their superior knowledge of local water conditions to conduct night raids against besieging forces. The fall of Dobbin in September 1147 marked the beginning of systematic German penetration into the heart of Obodrite territory, with Henry the Lion's forces advancing methodically from fortress to fortress, while establishing permanent garrisons at each captured position to prevent Wendish reoccupation. The siege of Oldenburg, the traditional capital of the Obodrite Confederation, began in October 1147 and continued through harsh winter months as German forces attempted to starve the defenders into submission. The fortress, perched on elevated ground overlooking the Oldenburger Graben, had been expanded and reinforced continuously since the 10th century. The defenders, led by Oberdreich Prince Niklot, demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical skill, conducting sorties that inflicted substantial casualties on besieging forces while maintaining morale through distribution of supplies that had been stockpiled in anticipation of prolonged siege. The breakthrough at Oldenburg came in March 1148 when German engineers succeeded in undermining a section of the fortress wall, creating a breach that allowed assault forces to penetrate the outer defensive perimeter. The subsequent fighting within the fortress complex demonstrated the desperate nature of Wendish resistance, with archaeological evidence revealing extensive fire damage and weapon deposits indicating prolonged close-quarters combat throughout residential and administrative areas. But here's what's truly heartbreaking. The destruction of the Arkona temple complex on the island of Rügen in June 1168 represented the symbolic culmination of the Northern Crusades, eliminating the most significant center of Wendish religious and cultural identity that had served as focal point for resistance against German expansion for nearly 2 centuries. The temple, dedicated to the four-faced god Svantevit, had been continuously expanded and enriched since its reconstruction following the uprising of 983, with archaeological evidence revealing a complex of buildings that included the main temple structure, subsidiary shrines, residential quarters for priests and temple servants, and extensive treasury facilities housing accumulated wealth of Wendish communities throughout the Baltic region. The assault on Arkona required specialized amphibious capabilities combining Danish naval expertise with German siege technology, resulting in construction of specialized vessels capable of transporting heavy siege equipment across treacherous waters surrounding Rügen. The final assault on Arkona began at dawn on June 15, 1168, with coordinated attacks against multiple sections of the fortress perimeter, designed to prevent defenders from concentrating their forces at any single point. The breakthrough came when German sappers succeeded in creating a large enough breach in the eastern wall to allow passage of armored cavalry, whose charge into the fortress courtyard broke organized resistance of Wendish defenders. The subsequent destruction of the temple complex was conducted with systematic thoroughness, reflecting both military necessity and religious zealotry, with the massive wooden idol of Svantevit being dismantled piece by piece and burned in a ceremonial fire that lasted for 3 days. The treasure recovered from Arkona exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of crusading forces, with contemporary sources describing quantities of gold, silver, precious stones, and exotic materials that had been accumulated through centuries of tribute payments and religious offerings from Wendish communities throughout Northern Europe. Archaeological investigations have confirmed the extraordinary wealth of the temple complex, with excavations revealing hidden chambers and underground storage facilities containing thousands of silver coins, elaborate jewelry, precious weapons, and religious artifacts crafted from materials including amber, ivory, and rare metals. The systematic colonization policies implemented in conquered Wendish territories represented fundamental departure from earlier German approaches that had focused primarily on tribute extraction and nominal political control. The new colonial administration, supervised directly by the German royal court, established comprehensive settlement programs designed to replace existing Wendish population with German colonists who would provide reliable military service and agricultural productivity. These colonization efforts required massive logistical coordination, with entire communities being relocated from overcrowded regions of Germany to establish new settlements in conquered territories. The establishment of German administrative control involved construction of entirely new infrastructure of castles, administrative centers, and religious institutions designed to maintain permanent German dominance over conquered populations. The religious transformation of conquered territories proceeded simultaneously with military occupation, with systematic destruction of Wendish cult sites, accompanied by construction of Christian churches and monasteries designed to serve both spiritual and administrative functions. The economic integration of conquered Wendish territories into broader German administrative system required fundamental changes in agricultural practices, land tenure arrangements, and commercial relationships that had evolved over centuries of independent development. German colonial administrators implemented the manorial system throughout conquered regions, replacing traditional Wendish collective land use patterns with individual holdings tied to feudal obligations and military service requirements. Archaeological evidence from rural sites reveals systematic reorganization of field systems and settlement patterns during this period, with new village layouts and agricultural techniques reflecting German farming practices rather than traditional Wendish methods. The resistance to German colonization efforts persisted throughout the conquest period, with Wendish communities employing various strategies to maintain their cultural identity and traditional practices despite official policies designed to eliminate all traces of pre-Christian civilization. The systematic German colonization of Wendish territories, known as the Ostsiedlung movement, beginning in earnest during the 1160s, represented one of the most comprehensive demographic transformations in medieval European history, fundamentally altering not only the ethnic composition of vast regions between the Elbe and Oder rivers, but also introducing entirely new systems of agricultural production, urban organization, and legal administration that would permanently reshape the cultural landscape of Central Europe. The recruitment of German colonists followed carefully planned strategies targeting specific demographic groups whose skills and social organization would prove most effective in establishing stable settlements in conquered territories. Flemish farmers, renowned throughout medieval Europe for their advanced agricultural techniques and experience in draining marshlands, formed significant component of early colonial population, bringing sophisticated knowledge of hydraulic engineering and intensive farming methods that could maximize productivity from heavy clay soils, characteristic of much of former Wendish territory. Saxon peasants from overcrowded regions around Brunswick and Goslar comprised another major component. Attracted by promises of land grants and tax exemptions offering opportunities for social advancement impossible in their traditional homeland, the transformation of existing Wendish settlements into German colonial towns required systematic demolition and reconstruction, eliminating virtually all traces of pre-conquest cultural patterns, while establishing entirely new urban layouts designed to accommodate German legal and social institutions. The former Wendish stronghold at Brandenburg underwent complete reconstruction following its capture in 1157, with German engineers demolishing the traditional circular fortification layout and replacing it with a rectangular grid system incorporating separate districts for administrative, commercial and residential functions. Agricultural practices throughout former Wendish territories underwent systematic transformation as German colonists introduced advanced farming techniques, dramatically increasing productivity while requiring fundamental changes in land use patterns and labor organization. The implementation of the three-field system replaced traditional Wendish extensive farming methods with intensive cultivation techniques, maximizing yields from available agricultural land while maintaining soil fertility through systematic crop rotation and fallowing practices. The introduction of heavy-wheeled plows, drawn by teams of oxen, represented technological revolution, enabling German colonists to cultivate heavy clay soils far more effectively than had been possible using traditional Wendish light plows. Urban development patterns in colonial territories reflected comprehensive planning strategies incorporating both practical considerations of defense and administration and symbolic elements designed to demonstrate German cultural superiority over conquered Wendish populations. Colonial towns were typically established using standardized grid layouts, maximizing commercial efficiency while providing clear sight lines for defensive purposes, with central market squares surrounded by administrative buildings, churches, and guild halls serving as focal points for colonial social and economic life. Linguistic assimilation processes throughout conquered territories proceeded through systematic policies designed to eliminate Wendish language use while establishing German as exclusive medium for all official, commercial, and religious activities. Colonial administrators implemented comprehensive language requirements prohibiting use of Wendish languages in legal proceedings, commercial transactions, and religious services, while establishing German language schools and requiring German literacy for participation in guild activities and urban governance. The gradual decline of Wendish language use in daily life resulted from both official policies and practical considerations, making German language skills essential for economic and social advancement within colonial system. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts reveals progressive disappearance of Wendish language inscriptions on household objects and personal items, replaced by German language markings indicating linguistic transformation of even private family life. Yet despite everything, despite the Crusades, despite the massacres, despite centuries of systematic suppression, certain Wendish communities refused to disappear. The systematic German colonization of Wendish territories proved remarkably successful across most conquered regions, yet certain geographical and political circumstances enabled small pockets of Wendish populations to maintain their cultural identity and linguistic traditions despite centuries of assimilationist pressure. The most significant of these surviving communities concentrated in the Lusatian region, where complex topography of forests, marshlands, and river valleys provided natural refuges that German administrative control penetrated slowly and incompletely. The Sorbian populations inhabiting this region, descendants of original Wendish tribes that had settled along upper reaches of the Spree and Neisse rivers during 6th century migrations, managed to preserve essential elements of their ancestral culture through adaptive strategies, balancing accommodation with German political authority against determined resistance to complete cultural assimilation. The geographical concentration of Sorbian populations in Lusatia reflected both historical settlement patterns and practical limitations of German colonial expansion in regions characterized by difficult terrain and marginal agricultural potential. The survival of Sorbian communities required sophisticated strategies for navigating complex political landscape created by German conquest and colonization, with community leaders developing diplomatic approaches acknowledging German political authority while preserving maximum autonomy in cultural and religious matters. The establishment of tributary relationships with German noble families provided Sorbian communities with protection from most aggressive colonization policies, while creating obligations that could be fulfilled through traditional economic activities rather than requiring fundamental changes in social organization or cultural practices. Upper Sorbian communities concentrated around the emerging German administrative center at Bautzen developed cultural practices incorporating selective German influences while preserving core elements of traditional Wendish social organization, religious beliefs, and artistic traditions. Lower Sorbian populations inhabiting more remote forest and marshland regions north of the Spree River maintained cultural practices showing less German influence and preserving more archaic elements of traditional Wendish civilization. The relative isolation of these communities from major German trade routes and administrative centers enabled continuation of traditional subsistence practices, seasonal migration patterns, and religious observances that had largely disappeared from regions experiencing intensive German colonization. The linguistic evolution of Sorbian languages during medieval and early modern periods provides crucial evidence for understanding processes through which minority populations maintained cultural identity under conditions of political subordination and demographic pressure from dominant populations. Upper Sorbian developed along different trajectories than Lower Sorbian, with greater incorporation of German loanwords and grammatical influences reflecting more intensive contact with German-speaking populations, while Lower Sorbian preserved more archaic phonological and morphological features, linking it directly to broader West Slavic linguistic family. The preservation of Sorbian oral traditions played crucial role in maintaining cultural continuity across generations, experiencing varying degrees of pressure to assimilate into German cultural norms, with traditional songs, stories, and ceremonial texts serving as repositories for historical memory and cultural knowledge that could not be preserved through written documentation. Traditional Sorbian epic songs preserve detailed historical narratives describing original Wendish migrations, establishment of tribal territories, conflicts with German expansion, and heroic resistance of legendary leaders whose exploits provided models for cultural persistence under adverse conditions. Then came a turning point. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century created unprecedented opportunities for Sorbian communities to develop literary traditions and educational institutions preserving their ancestral languages while adapting to theological and political changes sweeping through Central Europe. Lutheran theological emphasis on vernacular religious instruction provided crucial justification for developing Sorbian language religious literature, with Protestant reformers arguing that effective Christian education required use of languages that congregations could understand rather than the Latin that had dominated Catholic religious practice. The earliest systematic efforts to create written Sorbian literature began around 1548, when Mikław Jakubicz, a Lutheran pastor serving communities in the Bautzen region, undertook translation of basic religious texts into Upper Sorbian using orthographic conventions he developed through careful analysis of spoken Sorbian phonology and comparison with established German and Latin writing systems. The production of the first printed Sorbian catechism in 1574 represented a watershed moment in development of Sorbian literary culture, providing Sorbian communities with access to their ancestral language in prestigious medium of print, while establishing orthographic and grammatical standards that would influence Sorbian literary development for centuries. Lower Sorbian literary development followed parallel trajectory under leadership of Albin Moller, whose translation of the New Testament into Lower Sorbian during the 1580s created foundation for Lower Sorbian written literature, while addressing distinct linguistic characteristics differentiating Lower Sorbian from its Upper Sorbian counterpart. The development of Sorbian hymn traditions during late 16th and early 17th centuries created opportunities for preserving traditional Sorbian musical forms within Protestant liturgical contexts, while adapting ancient melodies and poetic structures to Christian theological content. The establishment of Sorbian language schools in connection with Protestant churches created systematic educational opportunities, enabling Sorbian children to acquire literacy in their ancestral language while receiving religious instruction and basic academic training, preparing them for participation in German-dominated economic and administrative systems. Catholic responses to Protestant educational initiatives included development of Catholic Sorbian language, religious literature and educational programs designed to maintain Catholic loyalty among Sorbian populations while competing with Protestant efforts to win Sorbian religious allegiance through vernacular religious instruction. The devastation wrought by the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, fundamentally transformed demographic and cultural landscape of Sorbian territories, creating both catastrophic disruptions to traditional community structures and unexpected opportunities for cultural preservation as German administrative control weakened throughout the conflict period. The initial Swedish invasion of Lusatia in 1631 resulted in systematic destruction of German administrative centers, while Sorbian rural communities, accustomed to subsistence agriculture and forest refuge strategies, proved remarkably resilient to military occupation and resource extraction. The withdrawal of Swedish forces in 1635 left vast regions of traditional Sorbian territory effectively ungoverned, with German administrative personnel having fled or perished during occupation, while local Sorbian communities maintained social organization through traditional kinship networks and religious institutions that had preserved community cohesion throughout the military crisis. Archaeological evidence from sites like Crostwitz and Hoyerswerda reveals extensive destruction layers from the 1630s, followed by reconstruction phases utilizing traditional Sorbian building techniques and settlement patterns rather than German architectural forms that had been imposed during previous century of colonial administration. The gradual restoration of Saxon administrative control during the 1640s encountered Sorbian communities that had effectively reverted to traditional social and economic organization during period of administrative collapse, creating complex challenges for German authorities attempting to re-establish colonial administrative structures while managing populations that had demonstrated their capacity for autonomous governance. The compromise arrangements negotiated during this period typically recognized traditional Sorbian community leadership while requiring formal acknowledgement of Saxon political authority, with administrative agreements preserving significant community autonomy in exchange for tribute payments and military service obligations. The emergence of Ernst Gottlob Haubold as pivotal figure in Sorbian cultural preservation during late 17th century marked beginning of systematic scholarly efforts to document and preserve Sorbian linguistic and cultural traditions through academic research methods combining traditional community knowledge with emerging European scholarly techniques. Haubold's linguistic studies, conducted primarily in the Bautzen region during the 1690s, produced first comprehensive grammatical analysis of Upper Sorbian, establishing standardized orthographic conventions while documenting dialectal variations and historical linguistic development connecting contemporary Sorbian to broader Slavic linguistic traditions. The parallel scholarly work conducted by Jurij Haustin-Svetlik in Lower Sorbian regions during early 18th century complemented Haubold's Upper Sorbian research while addressing distinct linguistic and cultural characteristics differentiating Lower Sorbian communities from their southern counterparts. His translation projects, including his 1706 Lower Sorbian version of the Complete Bible, required extensive linguistic research and community consultation, producing detailed documentation of Lower Sorbian vocabulary, grammatical structures, and cultural concepts having no equivalent in German linguistic traditions. The establishment of the Sorbian Seminary in Prague during 1728 created first systematic institutional framework for training Sorbian clergy and educators, with academic programs combining traditional Catholic theological instruction with specialized training in Sorbian languages, literature, and cultural traditions. The development of Sorbian printing capabilities during 18th century enabled systematic production of Sorbian language literature extending beyond religious texts to include secular works addressing practical subjects like agriculture, medicine, and legal procedures, serving daily needs of Sorbian communities while preserving traditional knowledge systems within written literary forms. Administrative reforms implemented throughout Saxon territories during reign of Augustus III created new opportunities for Sorbian participation in local governance while maintaining German administrative oversight through systematic bureaucratic structures balancing community autonomy with state administrative requirements. The Saxon Administrative Code of 1764 formally recognized Sorbian customary law in matters involving family relationships, property inheritance, and local dispute resolution, provided these traditional legal practices did not conflict with Saxon state law or imperial administrative requirements. Prussian administrative policies implemented in Sorbian territories acquired during the 7 Years' War reflected different approaches to minority population management emphasizing cultural assimilation through educational and economic incentives rather than direct suppression of indigenous cultural practices characterizing earlier German colonial policies. The Prussian General School Regulation of 1763 required establishment of German language schools throughout Sorbian regions, while permitting supplementary instruction in Sorbian languages for religious education and basic literacy training that could facilitate German language acquisition among Sorbian children. The systematic archaeological documentation of Wendish settlement patterns and material culture traditions began during late 18th century as Enlightenment scholarly interest in historical development and cultural diversity created academic frameworks for studying indigenous European populations that had previously been dismissed as historically insignificant by German scholarly traditions. The archaeological investigations conducted by Johann Christoph Adelung throughout Lusatian regions during the 1780s produced detailed documentation of traditional Wendish fortification systems, burial practices, and settlement layouts, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and community organization, contradicting German assumptions about Slavic cultural inferiority. Settlement pattern analysis conducted through systematic field surveys revealed persistence of traditional Wendish village organization and agricultural arrangements despite German administrative efforts to impose standardized colonial settlement forms throughout conquered territories. Traditional Wendish villages typically maintained circular or semicircular layouts, with central communal areas surrounded by family compounds, reflecting extended kinship relationships and cooperative agricultural practices differing significantly from German individual farmstead arrangements. Material culture studies based on systematic artifact analysis revealed sophisticated craft production traditions, maintaining technological competence and artistic distinctiveness while adapting to changing economic circumstances and market relationships throughout early modern period. Traditional Sorbian pottery production continued to utilize distinctive decorative motifs and vessel forms, preserving pre-Christian symbolic systems while incorporating new functional requirements and aesthetic influences derived from contact with German and broader European ceramic traditions. Textile production analysis based on preserved examples and archaeological evidence revealed sophisticated weaving traditions maintaining distinctive Sorbian decorative patterns and color combinations while adapting to changing fashion preferences and commercial opportunities throughout early modern period. Agricultural practices documented through systematic analysis of field systems, crop remains, and traditional farming techniques revealed sophisticated land use strategies, maximizing productivity from marginal soils and variable climatic conditions while maintaining ecological sustainability and community food security throughout early modern period. Traditional Sorbian agricultural knowledge included detailed understanding of soil management, crop rotation, and seasonal timing, enabling successful farming in forest and marshland environments that German colonists often found challenging to cultivate effectively. Forest management practices preserved through traditional knowledge systems and documented through a historical analysis revealed sophisticated understanding of woodland ecology and sustainable resource extraction, enabling Sorbian communities to maintain forest-based economic activities while meeting German administrative requirements for timber and forest product delivery. Traditional Sorbian forest management included controlled burning, selective harvesting, and wildlife management techniques, maintaining forest productivity while providing diverse resources including timber, fuel, medicinal plants, and food supplements, supporting community subsistence and commercial activities. The cultural legacy established during this period of consolidation created institutional and intellectual foundations enabling Sorbian cultural survival through subsequent centuries of political change and assimilationist pressure. The scholarly documentation of Sorbian languages, literature, and cultural traditions provided permanent records preserving essential cultural knowledge while demonstrating the sophistication and historical significance of Wendish civilization to broader European intellectual communities. The establishment of educational institutions and literary traditions created systematic mechanisms for cultural transmission that could adapt to changing political circumstances while maintaining essential elements of Sorbian identity and cultural continuity. The administrative compromises negotiated between Sorbian communities and German authorities during this period established precedents for minority rights and cultural autonomy that would influence later political developments and provide legal foundations for Sorbian cultural preservation efforts. The formal recognition of Sorbian languages and customary practices within German administrative frameworks created institutional arrangements balancing assimilationist pressures with practical recognition of cultural diversity and community autonomy. Economic activities within Sorbian communities evolved to accommodate German political and administrative requirements while preserving traditional subsistence practices and craft production techniques, maintaining cultural distinctiveness and providing economic foundations for community autonomy. Traditional Sorbian agricultural practices adapted to specific environmental conditions of the Lusatian region continued to provide economic foundation for community life despite German efforts to promote adoption of more intensive farming methods and commercial crop production. Forest exploitation remained a crucial component of Sorbian economic life throughout medieval and early modern periods, with traditional knowledge of woodland management and forest product processing providing Sorbian communities with economic resources highly valued in German markets while requiring minimal adaptation to German commercial practices. Sorbian communities developed sophisticated techniques for sustainable timber harvesting, charcoal production, and gathering of forest products, including medicinal plants, dyes, and craft materials, enabling them to participate in regional economic networks while maintaining traditional relationships with forest ecosystems. Craft production within Sorbian communities preserved traditional techniques and artistic traditions, maintaining cultural distinctiveness while producing goods competitive in German markets and meeting material needs of Sorbian households. Traditional Sorbian metalwork incorporated religious and ceremonial elements derived from pre-Christian cultural traditions, with decorative patterns and ritual objects preserving ancient symbolic meanings within contexts acceptable to German administrative and religious authorities. Social organization within Sorbian communities evolved to balance traditional kinship structures and community governance systems with requirements of German administrative oversight and legal jurisdiction. Traditional Sorbian extended family systems continued to provide foundation for community organization and resource management, with kinship networks serving crucial functions in maintaining cultural transmission, economic cooperation, and mutual support enabling community survival under conditions of political subordination. Community leadership structures adapted to German administrative requirements while preserving traditional decision-making processes and conflict resolution mechanisms, maintaining social cohesion and cultural continuity. Marriage practices within Sorbian communities preserved traditional customs and ceremonial elements, maintaining cultural identity while accommodating German legal requirements and religious oversight. Traditional Sorbian wedding ceremonies incorporated elaborate ritual sequences, ceremonial foods, and symbolic objects, preserving ancient cultural meanings while adapting to Christian theological frameworks and German legal procedures. Seasonal festivals and ceremonial observances provided crucial opportunities for Sorbian communities to maintain cultural traditions and strengthen social bonds, supporting community resilience under conditions of external pressure and cultural marginalization. The development of Sorbian cultural institutions during early modern period created organizational frameworks enabling systematic cultural preservation efforts while maintaining acceptable relationships with German administrative and religious authorities. Community organizations focused on cultural preservation activities, including collection and documentation of traditional songs, stories, and customs that might otherwise have been lost to assimilationist pressures and generational change. These cultural preservation efforts required careful balance between maintaining cultural authenticity and avoiding activities that might be interpreted as political resistance or religious heterodoxy by German authorities who remained suspicious of indigenous cultural practices they could not fully understand or control. The transformation of Wendish territories from contested frontier regions to integrated components of German administrative systems represented one of the most comprehensive processes of cultural change and political consolidation in medieval and early modern European history. The survival of Sorbian communities through this extended period of political subordination and cultural pressure demonstrated remarkable adaptability and cultural resilience, preserving essential elements of ancient Wendish civilization while adapting to changing historical circumstances. Religious instruction conducted exclusively in German provided crucial mechanism for linguistic assimilation, with church services, religious education, and ceremonial activities serving as regular opportunities for Wendish populations to encounter German language use in formal contexts, emphasizing its cultural and spiritual authority. The establishment of German language schools throughout colonial territories ensured that younger generations acquired German literacy and linguistic competence while having limited exposure to traditional Wendish languages, facilitating rapid linguistic transformation of colonial populations within a single generation. Commercial activities conducted according to German legal and linguistic standards created powerful economic incentives for Wendish language abandonment, with participation in colonial trade networks requiring German language competence and familiarity with German commercial practices and legal procedures. To the persistence of Wendish linguistic elements in place names and specialized vocabulary related to local environmental conditions provides evidence of gradual nature of this linguistic transformation, with some Wendish terms being incorporated into local German dialects, while broader Wendish linguistic system disappeared from active use. The systematic incorporation of former Wendish territories into Holy Roman Empire's administrative framework required development of entirely new governmental structures capable of effectively managing vast regions populated by diverse ethnic groups while maintaining imperial authority and extracting sufficient revenues to support ongoing military operations and administrative expenses. The establishment of the Margraviate of Brandenburg in 1157 under Albert the Bear represented first comprehensive attempt to create stable administrative institutions capable of governing conquered Wendish lands according to German legal principles, while accommodating practical realities of ruling populations retaining distinct cultural practices and economic systems. The administrative staff required for maintaining these records included trained clerks, legal specialists, and financial administrators recruited from established German territories, creating professional bureaucratic class, serving as backbone of imperial administration in conquered regions. Legal status of remaining Wendish populations within the Margraviate created complex administrative challenges requiring development of new legal categories and procedures accommodating indigenous customary practices within German legal frameworks while ensuring imperial authority over all territorial inhabitants. The economic integration of former Wendish territories into imperial administrative systems required fundamental changes in agricultural production, resource extraction, and commercial organization, transforming traditional subsistence economies into market-oriented systems capable of generating surpluses necessary to support imperial administrative expenses and military operations. The implementation of German agricultural techniques throughout conquered territories increased productivity while creating new forms of economic organization, tying rural populations more closely to imperial administrative structures through tax obligations, feudal services, and market relationships, replacing traditional Wendish economic autonomy with systematic integration into German economic systems. Today, against all odds, approximately 60,000 Sorbs still live in Lusatia, maintaining their language, customs, and cultural identity after surviving over 1,000 years of conquest, crusades, colonization, and assimilation policies that destroyed dozens of other indigenous European peoples. They preserve ancient Wendish traditions through colorful festivals, distinctive folk costumes, and the only surviving West Slavic language still spoken in Germany. Their villages, with bilingual signs in German and Sorbian, stand as living monuments to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of cultural memory. The scholarly and institutional achievements of the early modern period established foundations for continued Sorbian cultural development, enabling community survival through subsequent political changes while maintaining connections to broader Slavic cultural world and preserving unique contributions to European cultural diversity originating in ancient Wendish settlements along the rivers of Central Europe over a millennium earlier. The formal recognition of Sorbian languages and customary practices within German administrative frameworks created institutional arrangements demonstrating the possibility of maintaining indigenous cultural identity within dominant political systems while contributing to broader social and economic development. The transformation of Wendish territories from contested frontier regions to integrated components of German administrative systems represented one of the most comprehensive processes of cultural change and political consolidation in medieval and early modern European history. Yet the survival of Sorbian communities, through this extended period of political subordination and cultural pressure, demonstrated remarkable adaptability and cultural resilience, preserving essential elements of ancient Wendish civilization while adapting to changing historical circumstances. The story of the Wends, from their migration from the Pripet marshes in the 5th century through their resistance to Charlemagne, their great uprising of 983, the devastating Northern Crusades, the systematic German colonization that nearly erased them from history, to the miraculous survival of Sorbian culture in modern Germany, stands as testament to the enduring power of cultural identity and the indomitable human will to preserve ancestral heritage against overwhelming odds. Their legacy lives on not only in the Sorbian communities of Lusatia, but in the very landscape of Central Europe, where thousands of place names, archaeological sites, and cultural traditions still echo with the voices of the Wendish peoples who shaped this land for over a millennium. If you enjoyed this journey through one of Europe's most remarkable yet forgotten civilizations, from the migration of Proto-Slavic peoples along the great rivers of Central Europe through the golden age of Wendish independence, the horrors of the Northern Crusades, the systematic colonization that transformed an entire region, to the miraculous cultural survival of the Sorbian minority, subscribe to Flow of History for more deep dives into the lost civilizations and forgotten peoples that shaped our world.